Hi YouTube, welcome back to another video from Wtf Rc Cars. So, cracking on with the Losi Micro-B. We've got a bunch of GPM parts here. We have LMB 1200SBK, which is the steel transmission gears. We've got the LMB 013-B, which is the blue transmission housing. We've got the LMB 018B, which is the blue motor plate. And I think this is going to be quite a long video because it's quite in-depth doing this. So if you want to grab your centre cuppa and then come back, I'll bring you in for a closer look. Let's see how we get on with this lot. So, with the motor plate, you get the motor plate itself and two countersunk screws, so you can adjust the motor. With the rear sort of diff housing, you get the diff housing itself, you get two shorter screws. We do get one screw screwed into the casing, and then we get one longer screw. So as we strip this down, I'm going to try and work out whether that's for this top piece, which I don't think that's long enough to go through, or whether it's for one of the bits that fasten in somewhere else, or whether it's just a spare one. Because as all these parts, there is no instructions. Then for as gear set, we've got as two outputs, or some gears if you like. Then you've got your idler and the top one. Then we've got as actual diff as self. We've got 3 pins for these moon gears. Don't forget you'll need your small Allen key to take the pinion off. But this is what we've got in the packaging. They're all resealable zip bags, so you can put your old stuff back in them. But now we've got all the parts unpackaged, we need to start off with our RC. And for this, I think what I'm going to start off with is removing the actual spoiler itself. So for that, there's one screw here and then these two at the side. So I'll get them unscrewed and then we can carry on. So I've now undone this screw and the 2 screws at the side, and that should let our wing and the wing mount all come away. And these are the 050 parts. Let's see if I can get the last bit of these threads out. And if you want to make your life a bit easier, you can leave these screws in the actual wing and then you shouldn't be losing them. So once we've got all them removed, you've then got the 4 screws. So we've got 2 at the back and 2 at the front, and this will remove the actual shock tower. Now, just because it's going to make my life easier, and it will make it easier for you guys to see what I'm doing, I'm going to remove one of our top shock mounts. And we've got a little washer on here, so I'm just going to put it back into the shock mount itself. Just a few turns so we don't get losing anything. Just make sure you don't pop your little rubber O-rings off if you're running the GPM shocks. So I'll get these 4 screws undone and then we can carry on. Right, once we've got these 4 screws undone, we should be able to lift this up. And then if we just pop off one of his rear tie rods, then we should be able to lift all this to one side. And if you just push your screws down, it should save you losing any of these tiny little screws. And then it frees up our access to the actual housing. Right, just to make this easier for you guys to see, I'm going to remove the other shock. And then I can just get this whole shock tower assembly out the way. And again, I'm just going to put this screw back into the shock tower, just a few turns, save it going missing. And I'll clip the whole shock tower assembly off, and then we should be able to lift out our drive shafts. So we can put them to one side so we don't lose them. Then We got one screw at the front here that we can remove, and if memory serves me right, we should, once we've done this, have another one that's right in the bottom that holds the cover on. Now you should be able to leave that one in place, and we should be able to get everything out in one piece. So we can remove the screw that goes all the way through the back of the battery tray, and that should free up this whole assembly. Usually we'd have to take this rail off, but if we're removing all this anyway, it's going to lift up and give us enough room. I think anyway, at least. So next we can flip the RC completely over, and for this one we're going to need the 1.5mm drivers, and we're going to remove these 4 screws. So 1, 2, 3 and 4. I'll get them removed and then we can carry on. So now we've got these removed, we should be able to flip his RC back over, and all this rear assembly is now loose. So all we need to do is disconnect his motor. If you've got a brushless one, just be very careful with your actual sensor wire and everything, but we should be able to separate everything from our housing. So you can get all this rear assembly off in one piece and just pop it to one side. So I'm just going to disconnect my motor, and that'll get all this unit off, and we're not going to risk breaking any of these tiny wires. So we've now separated our gearbox unit and everything from the RC, so we can move that to one side. You don't need to use the Velcro, which is good because mine come unstuck from the body shell second time I took it off, as we do get that with the GPM parts, so we get some new Velcro. So now we can get to the lower screw, which will allow us to remove this. So we can put that with our longer screw from the top. That'll get us our motor cover off. I'm not sure if I'm going to refit that. I might leave it off. And then we can lift this out of place, put that back with our rear suspension. So next we're going to have to get our tiny little Allen key, and you're just going to need to line up your grub screw, and we can remove this. So then we can get his pinion gear off. Once his pinion's off, we've got his 2 motor screws. So we can quickly get these off and keep them safe. It'd be interesting to compare the length of threads on these between these that come with the Furitech, which are still tapered. These are the ones that come with the GPM part. They're slightly longer, so for me I'm going to try the Furitech ones, especially seems as though this motor plate is taped sort of countersunk on the sides. I don't want them threads going too far into the motor. So once we've got to this point, quite interesting that this has got 2 screws on this side, and we do get 2 screws with the new GPM one, so it's possibly these 2 that it supplies, and the back one on the GPM one is screwed in from the factory, so we don't need to get that one, it's already there. So if we look, you can see that's the screw that's fitted from the factory to keep it all together. We will need to separate all this. So we can remove that nut. And then we've got our drive gear. So for this, I don't believe the motor plate actually goes all the way through and holds anything else together. So we won't need to remove them, I don't think. But you can see the difference between the GPM plate. It's got a lot more movement than the stock plate. So it does give you a lot more option for gearing. So the next thing we can do is remove our output cups. So we've got the 3 screws that we're going to need to remove, and this is because we don't get the bearings with the GPM gears. So the rear one is the longest screw, and then we've got 2 more case screws. And looking at it, I'm thinking maybe the screws it gives you with the GPM unit, maybe they're those 2, but then you do get a longer one, and I'm not seeing where that longer one would fit. I think we are going to need these 2 screws to attach the motor plate, because we only get 4 screws with the actual GPM housing. Some instructions would be nice, but we don't get them with any of it. So that is everything stripped down. You do have the shaft that runs through the middle of this, and I don't believe we get that with the GPM gears. So we're going to have to remove that and keep that one safe. Then we should be able to separate our gearbox casing. Can't see any other screws, so I think the only thing holding it together will be the factory Velcro. So we can remove that. So then we've got our gearbox casing. Then we need to get our new diff housing or gearbox casing. Going to remove that rear screw, keep that to one side. And then if we lay this out the same way, so the first thing we're going to need to transfer across is the bearing. So we can remove that and place it into the housing. Then we're going to need as bearings and everything off of all these gears. So I think I'll start by lifting this out. And I don't want to lose any of these little bearings or anything. So this is the stock configuration. We'll keep that to one side. I'll just pop out the casing bearing on this side, the bigger one. So it looks like ours was fitted with 2 shims. So it's going to be interesting to see if we need to shim this. So I'll try it with just the bearing first, and then we've got 2 shims we can use on either one side like it was at factory, or we may need to shim either side. Then if we look at our gears, we can pop these out, and we've got a bearing that sits either side. So the slightly bigger one will go on the outside. The tiny one will sit on the back of this gear. and we can drop them into place. Then we've got some tiny bearings in here, so we'll get our shaft out first. Then we just need to remove these bearings. So we've got this one that sits on that side. And we've got the one from the back of the gear. Then we've got this tiny little shaft. So once we've got our shaft and there's bearings on his new gear, we can then get that into place. Make sure it's seated. Now, grease wise, depends on what surface you're running this. The stock gears just look like they've got white moly grease in them. So I think for me, I'm going to try this hoodie graphite grease because I want these to run quite free. So all I'm going to do is just put some of this in here and just let it work its way around. So I'll get this greased up. So we got a bunch of the black graphite grease in here. Should keep it running really free. Then we need to build up our diff. So for this we're going to start with the diff gear. Then we're going to have to grab one of these tiny little shafts and drop it through as gear, and then drop the gear in place. So that's how it's going to need to sit, and we're going to get all the three of the others in place and then get some black diff grease on them. So I'll get that assembled and then we can carry on. So we've now got the tiny little gears in. I'm just going to get some graphite grease in that and grease it up. So now we've got a good bit of grease in here. I'm going to place the output gear on the top of it. Then we're going to have to flip this upside down without dropping everything all over. So we just need to work the grease around. And I'm just going to grab one of these output cups just because it makes it a bit easier to do this. So now I'm going to grease this side and get the other output cup in place. So now we've got this in place, we can drop our other gear on. Then we need to drop our center shaft through the middle to help line everything up. And then we've got to drop this into the actual housing. So I think now would be a good time to drop our casing together. So once we've got this together, we need to make sure the center shaft's in, get our two output cups on, and then we can try and see if there's any play. So there's definitely some play in there. So what I'm going to try is one shim either side and see if we can take that play out. So I think first off, I'm just going to drop one side of this housing off. And I'm going to drop one of these shims in, just to see how much of that play it does actually take away with just one shim. So if you hold it really tight, yeah, that's took a lot away. So I think certainly on mine we're going to need a shim in either side. Not sure why both shims were just in one side, but I'm sure as we assemble this we'll find out if it causes any problems shimming both sides. Yeah, that's perfect. One shim in either side. It rotates really nicely. But let's see if it actually works as a diff. So I think moving on, so I want to start by getting this back in. Remember, don't over tighten this. Then we've got two more screws, and I'm going to use the ones that came with the GPM parts on this. So we've got one that fastens in there, and the second one that was screwed in there. That should keep us housing together. So definitely something I've noticed, there's definitely a tight spot on these diff gears. So I think for me, I'm just going to drop this cover off and take the one shim out from this side, because it definitely seems, once we've tightened the screws up, there's definitely a tight spot on it. So where I've got it to now, there it's really loose, and as you spin it, there's just a tight spot on it. So I think we just need to take a little bit of pressure off, so I'm going to go down to one shim. So with that one shim removed, way freer. So definitely looks like that's the way to go with it. You just got to try it. Your mileage may vary. Just mess around with it until you get it lined up. So one part I forgot I'd got, but we have, is the LMB 036 TSBK. Right, so next thing, we're going to be fitting our motor plate so we can get that reattached. And strangely enough for this one, it just gives you one screw with the GPM bit. So whether we've got screws missing again or not, I'm not sure. But we do have loads of these from the stock parts. I must admit, I'm quite surprised they actually supplied the screws to fit the casing back together, because they don't supply the bearings. And on most of the parts, they just expect you to reuse your stock screws. So guessing this is the same. So we've got one screw, and the screw that they do supply with the GPM parts is exactly the same length as the stock screws. So I don't suppose it makes any difference. We've just got a bunch of spare screws now. So once we get those two back in, just be a good idea to make sure your diff's still working, so we know none of these screws have gone in and nipped anything up. Then we can use the LMB 036 TSBK, which is the carbon steel spur gear from GPM. So that fits into place nicely. We can then drop on our little nut to hold it all together. And I thought if we're changing the internal gears, we may as well do the spur gear as well. So we've got that in place, and with this black grease it does feel really free, and that stuff works its way around absolutely everywhere. So It'll get all over your fingers, your table, anything else you're going near. And for some reason, 3 weeks after you've been using it, you'll still find bits stuck in your face, your clothes, your socks, whatever you've been near. But now, once we've got that all in place, as next stop is to get us motor mounted. So if you remember where I had it in my RC, I had the motor wires mounted towards the back, so I want to keep it that way. So if we look, it does line up perfect. So you've got quite a lot of choice of how you want to line these motors up, but I'm going to try and get it that way, which is what I had in first place. So for me, I'm going to use the stock screws that came with the motor, just because they're slightly shorter, and I just want to make sure that they fit, and I don't want them screwing in and getting through to the windings that are quite open on this motor. I think there is a small plastic plate, but if the screw pushes through that, it's going to destroy your windings, and you really don't want that. There is an awful lot of room now between the motor and the actual gearbox housing, so that's nice to see. Oh, let's see what sort of task it is to line a pinion up with these. Not the easiest motor plate to slide, but if you get the tension right on the screws, you should have plenty of adjustment. So now we need to fiddle with the world's smallest pinion, and I would have liked to try a different pinion on the Furitech motor, because I've got a few for this sized, or what you'd use in like a 24th scale RC. Unfortunately, the Furitech shaft is a totally different size to just about anything else out there. So if you've got pinion gears for hobby wing motors or surpass or anything like that, they won't fit on the motor shaft for this motor. So now we just need to correct us meshing. So I'll just slightly nip these up. And with these being metal on metal gears, it is really important you get this meshing correct. You also want to make sure that you're not getting the pinion catching on the metal motor plate or anything like that. But that feels really nice, so let's see if it holds its position as we tighten it up. One of the things I'm concerned about is how thin these walls are, so be very careful when you're tightening these up, because I think they will, with them being tapered, force that motor plate apart. But you want a tiny amount of play. Be interesting to hear what these sound like as well. So let's have a look what else we've got. So one thing to note, without any modification on here, you're not going to get the motor cover back on, because this motor mount is a lot bigger. So you can, if you want, cut the actual motor mount to make it fit, but you would need the GPM motor cover if you're going to refit the cover. We'll make it interesting for this screw at the top, because we've got no way of fastening that in now if we're not using the cover. But I know most guys that are at the track, because they want to change the gear in and keep an eye on the motor mesh, they're not running a cover on these. We are just running on carpet, so it's not like we're getting dirt or anything in there, but it's just something to bear in mind. So next we're going to need to reassemble everything. So we're going to need to get our rear suspension in position, and then we're going to have to lower it all to where we need it and hope it stays. Then we're going to need the RC itself. So we're going to have to get that into position. Make sure it all lines up on the top. And then once we got it somewhere near, we can get us 4 screws back in. For these, you're going to need the 1.5mm driver. So I would just get these started before you tighten everything up. And then once you've got them all started, you can just nip them all down, and then we just need to finally tighten them up. As with everything on this, don't go crazy tight with them, because you're just going to strip threads or you're going to rip the heads clean off them. But once we've got that in place, give you a good idea of what it all looks like. So it is all lined up, it does fit right, there's no binding on suspension or anything as gears are working. So now we have the lovely task of playing with tiny little drive shafts. So we need to carefully line these back up. Which is a lot easier if you're not trying to get all this on camera. So if we get them into position, then we can get as rear shock mount, and we're going to have to put as little track rods back on and just give it a final check. Make sure your drive shafts haven't fallen out. Then we can lower this into position, and we've just got us 4 screws that we need to tighten up. That's these 2 on the back and those 2 on the front. So I'll get them tightened up and then we can carry on. Right, now we've got our screws back in, as drive shafts back in, we can get our shocks back on. Just remember where to put your little washers if you've got the GPM shocks. And for me, I'm still going for outermost holes at the moment. So we've got them in place. We've got a suspension working. So then we've got our rear spoiler or wing. And we just need to put the 3 screws back into place on this. So the screws on this one is that and that one. So I'll get them screwed in. Now we could go down the path of finding a nut for the back of this. That would be an option. The other option is you could use a body clip and just put it straight through it. So that's definitely another option. I mean, it is in there pretty tight, so it's not going to come out anyway, but it would be nice to have just a little nut on the end of it. But I'm going to have a look around, see what sort of options I've got, or see if I've got a small body clip that we could put through. That would also be another usable option. So let's see if I can get you zoomed in on it. But for me, body pin slides under, so it latches in perfect. If you really wanted, if you could clip the ends down a bit, but it ain't going to come out of there. It's still going to allow you to lever this up if you want to change battery, and it means you don't have to run this whole assembly that covers the gears, so you can get to swap your pinion out, you can get to adjust the motor. You could, if you've got a small enough set of pliers or something, you could get your spur gear out if you want to change your gearing. So yeah, I think that's the option I'm going to go with, and if I want to remove it, I've just got to pull it out. So we then don't need any of these screws from the motor housing. So yeah, that is the GPM rear bulkhead and gears fitted. I've just got to reconnect my sense cable and my motor. So if I just plug that in, and then I've just got to get some little tiny pliers to connect the sense cable to backup motor. But that is all fitted. It's definitely nice and free on the diff. There is still a very slight tight spot. I'm hoping that comes out as we get using it. If it doesn't, I will report back. It definitely does not feel as smooth as the stock diff out the box. There's definitely little rough patches on these gears, but the geared diffs can take a little while to sort of wear in. I did only need to use one shim on this. If I put two in, then where the tight spot is, it was really notchy. It just didn't feel happy at all. But other than that, it's where it's loose, it feels nice. Where it's not, it's just a tiny little bit of a notch. But as I'm spinning it round by hand, it's getting less and less. So I think as we run this, it should free itself off completely. As I say, if it doesn't, I will report back. They were the GPM gears. Endura also do a set of gears for it. In all honesty, looking at the stock diff, I don't see any problem with it. So I'm not seeing, although it's a potentially higher quality metal on the GPM diff, I don't think you're really going to have problems with the stock one. The idler gears, maybe. Certainly there's a advantage to having the metal idler gears. But as for the actual diff itself, if this one carries on being notchy, then I will swap back to the stock diff and just run that. But the diff housing and everything fits perfect. Doesn't cause any binding with suspension or anything. And it does look really nice. And I'm more than happy to run just the little body clip to allow me to flip this battery tray up. Still would like to get some thumb screws for these little things. But yeah, let's wrap this one up. So there we have it, all the GPM parts fitted. And I must admit, not a huge fan of this diff. If I just put it on steady, you can see it's a bit grabby. There it's locked completely. Now it's freed off again. So yeah, the GPM gears, I think so far from this, I would give the GPM gears a miss. Certainly the GPM diff, or this one, it feels pretty garbage. That's locked up solid, then it's freed off, and I can feel it. It's locked solid, freed off, locked solid. Yeah, I wouldn't go with the GPM gears at all. I think I'll be stripping this and swapping back to the stock diff. The metal gears that come with the diff seem fine. I have off camera stripped the diff down, had a look, can't find any burrs or anything, but there's obviously something wrong with it. The way it just locks solid, not really impressed with that. Not overly impressed with the Enduro adjustable parts either. But yeah, we'll have to see how it goes. I'll run this for a little bit, see if whatever burr is making that diff stiff does wear off. Do like the motor plate. I like the little body clip pin in back. Makes it quicker to take apart, and it saves having to get a little nut for back of that. I will be running it without the actual gear cover on, mainly because they're just a pain to remove. If you need to swap the pinion or anything, they're just unnecessary. None of us 1/10 cars run them, but yeah, that's where we're at so far. Quite happy with everything else, and yeah, if you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, share to friends and family, and catch you guys again in the next one.